This video has been sponsored by Ground News. Over the years, I've done many projects where I turned completely inedible things into food, like that time I turned plastic gloves into grape soda and hot sauce, as well as that other time when I turned cotton balls into cotton candy. What I've been really wanting to do for a while, though, is to try turning children's glue into drinkable alcohol, and at least in theory, this should be possible. This is because the main ingredient in most children's glue is a plastic called polyvinyl acetate, or PVA for short, and in its chemical structure, it contains all of these little groups here in blue, which are known as acetate groups. On their own, they aren't too special, but what I think is really interesting is that it should be possible to pull them off the PVA and to turn them into something known as acetic acid, which is essentially pure vinegar. Then after that, with just a bit more chemistry, I should be able to convert this acetic acid into some pure ethanol, which hopefully would be safe to drink. With that being said though, overall, I just thought that this whole idea sounded pretty fun to do, and I was also really curious to know what children's glue alcohol would taste like. So, despite the fact that I wasn't exactly sure how to do it, and that I very possibly might end up just completely failing, I decided to just go for it. So, I just went ahead and got started, and the first thing that I was gonna need was, of course, some children's glue, and I ended up going with Elmer's, which seemed to be the most common one. I also decided to go with a full gallon, which is about 3.78 liters, and this may seem like a lot, but I had absolutely no idea how much PVA was actually in here, or how efficient the process would be. But with that being said, now that I had the glue, it was time to try turning it all into alcohol, where the first step was to get a large dish, and to start dumping it in. This was because before doing any chemistry, I was gonna have to get rid of all the water that was in the glue, which was at least around 50% of its volume. I also figured that this was gonna be really simple, and that I basically just had to leave it out to dry, and I assumed that this was gonna go relatively quickly. However, that was not at all the case, and it turned out that drying glue like this was excruciatingly slow, mostly because the surface of it just quickly formed a really thick layer, which prevented the water below it from evaporating. To fix this though, I figured that I just had to keep peeling away the thicker layer and revealing the fresh wet glue below it. I also set up a fan off screen in an attempt to make this all go a bit faster, and at first, it seemed like it was gonna work. However, long story short, it only kind of worked, where it did definitely make it go faster, except even after 14 days of flipping it over and over, it still wasn't fully dry. It was only after wasting this much time, though, that I finally accepted that this was an absolutely horrible method that would probably take at least a few more months, and it was pretty clear that I was gonna have to try something else. So I decided to basically just do anything that I felt would speed it up, where the first thing that I thought of was to chop it up like a large cheesy lasagna, which I thought would really help the moisture escape. I then tossed the whole thing into a food dehydrator to heat it up, and after a full week, it was looking significantly better. However, after manually tearing off some of the glue and peeling away the rest with my multi-tool, it was obvious that it still wasn't fully dry, and I'll be honest, after waiting almost a month already, I was really tempted to just consider this dry enough. As one last-ditch effort though, I decided to try putting all of it into my new vacuum oven that I just happened to get earlier that week. With it all loaded in, I then pulled a vacuum on it, which would make it way easier for the moisture to escape the glue, and I ramped the temperature up to 80°C. I also kept it there, and I didn't raise it any higher, because at least from what I read online, anything hotter could potentially cause the PVA to start degrading. But either way, as the glue sat there, it did slowly get drier and drier, and eventually, after several more days, it seemed like all of the water had finally been removed. So I took it out, and now, after what was way too much effort and work, what I was left with were some super dry blocks of what was probably nearly pure PVA. At this point, it was also probably as dry as it was ever gonna get, so I just went and got my multi-tool, and I fully chopped it into pieces. This then left me with a bunch of rock-hard blocks of glue, which I was pretty happy with, and after weeks of kind of wasting my time, I was especially glad that this whole trying part was finally done. The only unfortunate thing was that the struggle wasn't quite over, because all of this PVA was actually useless to me as these large chunks. This is because to do any real chemistry with them, I was gonna have to be able to get them into a flask, which meant that they would have to be way smaller. This in turn meant that I was gonna have to break them into a bunch of tiny pieces, and at first I thought this would be relatively easy, and I figured that all I had to do was get a cheap food processor and to shred it like cheese. However, another long story short, that was absolutely not the case, and I ended up completely dulling out the blades and kind of breaking the machine. Uh-oh. I then moved on to ruining the blades in my blender, which also totally failed to break it apart, and when I completely gave up and started just smashing it with a hammer, the only thing that I was able to break was my table. No! My table! That's not good. So clearly, this glue was a lot tougher than I expected, and at this point, I was starting to worry that I might have to spend hours and hours manually chopping apart the squares using the multi-tool, which sounded absolutely horrible and probably wouldn't even work very well. After a bit of thinking though, and searching online, I ended up finding what I felt was the perfect solution, and after a few days of waiting, I became the proud owner of the cheapest wood chipper that I could find on Amazon. Then when I felt ready, I went and got all of the glue and turned on the chipper, and I was somewhat concerned that the glue would still manage to destroy it. However, it was apparently totally fine, and it had no problem ripping it apart, and this was definitely way better than having to do all of this manually. It was also kind of satisfying to see each piece getting sucked in and obliterated by the blades, and over the next few minutes, I had a lot of fun dropping in the rest of the glue. The only problem was that when I was eventually done, it was very clear that the pieces were still way too big, and to get them smaller, I was gonna have to pass them through again. This part was unfortunately not quite as fun or fast, but it did work, and I decided to just keep putting everything through the wood chipper over and over. This then caused the pieces to gradually get smaller and smaller until eventually I was reaching the limit of what the chipper was able to do. So I decided to stop here, and what I had now was a beaker full of small chunks of PVA, and what was nice was that they were all pretty much exactly the size that I wanted them to be. It was also very nice that this had only taken about 20 minutes instead of hours and hours of tediously chopping everything myself, and I'm very happy that I invested in the wood chipper. Moving on though, with all of the glue now ready, I could finally start doing the chemistry to turn this into some hopefully tasty alcohol, where the first step was to turn it into pure acetic acid. From a bit of research, it also seemed like there was probably a few different ways to do this, but from what I could tell, the best and easiest way was to basically just heat it up. So that was what I decided to do, and to get started, I just quickly transferred all of this glue into the biggest round bottom flask that I had. I then dropped it into a big heating mantle that I'd bought just for this, and I clamped it in place, and I continued putting together the rest of the setup by first adding a 3-way adapter with a thermometer in it, followed by a condenser column. With all of this in place, I was then able to quickly finish putting it all together, and only a few minutes later, this was what I had, where the flask here was where I was hoping to collect the acetic acid, and the tube here was connected to my vacuum pump. This was very important because this all had to be done under vacuum and without any oxygen present, otherwise the glue would probably just burn or become a crusty, charred mess. With all that being said though, I was just about ready to get started, and the only other thing that I still had to do was wedge a thermocouple between the flask and the heating mantle. This would allow me to monitor the temperature, and it wouldn't be super accurate, but it would still give me a decent reading of how hot the flask was. Now with all of this in place, it was finally time to start cooking some glue, and to get things going, I started by flipping on my vacuum pump. I then turned on the heating mantle as well, and I raised the temperature dial only slightly because the goal now was to heat things relatively slowly. This meant that at first, not much was gonna happen, and well, over the next 10 minutes, I really didn't notice much of a difference. When it eventually got to around 70°C though, I started seeing some fogging down here, and not too long after, I saw the first drop of liquid fall into the other flask. However, when I looked over at the thermometer, which was showing me the boiling point of the stuff that was coming over, I saw that it was only around 20°C, meaning that this was probably just residual water that was getting cooked out of the glue. It then continued just like this for the next 20 minutes or so, where I got more or less continual drips, and the temperature of the glue flask slowly increased. This in turn made the drip rate increase as well, and when the glue eventually got to around 160°C, the stuff coming over started turning yellow, which I thought was a very good sign. This was because it likely meant that the glue was starting to degrade, and even though what I was collecting was probably still mostly water, things were at least moving in the right direction. But either way, all I could do now was just keep waiting and hoping that the glue would really start breaking down, and well, eventually, several minutes later, that was exactly what seemed to be happening. This was because at this point, it had not only become significantly more yellow, it was also starting to let off some smoke, which was then traveling through the rest of the setup and filling up the other flask. I actually didn't know exactly what this was, but according to a paper that I found, most of it was supposed to be the acetic acid that I wanted, which was forming as the acetate groups on the polyvinyl acetate slowly got torn off. The rest of this vapor, though, was supposed to be a bunch of other crap like acetone and carcinogenic benzene, which was forming as the PVA plastic in general was breaking down. This in turn meant that in the end, I was probably going to end up with a horrible concoction of nasty chemicals, which wasn't exactly ideal, except that was something that I could worry about later on. But either way, getting back to the reaction, I quickly put together a little ice bath to try and help and condense the vapor, and when I looked back at the main flask, I noticed that the glue was significantly darker. From there, it then only continued to get darker and darker, and eventually, by the time the flask was at 200°C, it had developed a nice red color, and there was some nasty black liquid that had collected on the side of the flask. At the same time, the liquid that was coming over had also gotten a lot darker, and just by the color, I could tell that it was filled with a bunch of horrible and potentially carcinogenic chemicals. However, despite this, I was still very happy with how it was all going, because at least in theory, this was all still mostly acetic acid, and at this point, I had collected a pretty decent amount. From what I could tell, the rest of the distillation was also relatively straightforward, and I basically just had to keep heating it until the acetic acid stopped coming over. I of course had absolutely no idea when this would actually happen, but after about an hour, the temperature on the thermometer started rising much faster, which told me that I was starting to collect something else. I think we're getting to a completely new fraction here. Most of this was still probably acetic acid though, so I decided to keep collecting it until it got to around 120 C, which was over triple the boiling point of pure acetic acid under the current vacuum pressure. At this point, there was probably almost no acetic acid coming over, and the rate had also slowed down like crazy, but I still wanted to keep going, just to be absolutely sure that I collected everything. This didn't end up going on for very long though, because only a few minutes later, the temperature of the flask quickly spiked from the 230 C that it was at, all the way up to 380 C, which I really didn't like. I don't like that. It just went up 150 degrees in like 30 seconds. So, I think it's done. I think there's like nothing left in the flask. I'm not heating it anymore. I'm done. So, I just went ahead and ended it here, and I turned off the heating. I then went over to the other flask, and I got rid of the dish of cold water, and what I immediately noticed was that it had actually separated into two distinct layers. This told me that there was for sure a whole bunch of nasty crap in there, and I was pretty certain that the black layer on top was mostly the carcinogenic benzene. Moving on though, I then popped off the flask, and the moment that I took it out of the fume hood, I was hit by the smell of it, which can only be described as a mixture of burnt plastic and gasoline, and it pretty much gave me an instant headache. In my mind, this really reinforced the obvious fact that there was a whole bunch of nasty junk in there, because pure acetic acid should have smelled much more like really strong vinegar, and I was definitely going to have to clean it up. So, that was exactly what I started doing, where the first step was to pour it all into the biggest separatory funnel that I owned, and to let it sit there for a bit, for it to separate back into two layers. This then happened extremely slowly, and even several minutes later, it was really hard to see any difference, but I felt that it was good enough, and I started draining everything into a large beaker. At the same time, I also looked very closely at the separatory funnel to track where that upper layer of nasty black crap was, and when it eventually got to the bottom of the funnel, I closed the valve. I then quickly got rid of all of this mystery oily junk, and now, when I looked over at the stuff in the beaker, I felt that it was already looking a bit cleaner, which was good. It was still super dirty though, and I would of course have to do a bit more work, except before doing that, I wanted to do a quick test. More specifically, I wanted to do a pH test, because up until now, I hadn't really done anything to confirm that there was actually any acetic acid in here, and I'd basically been going on pure hope. So with that being said, I just went ahead and tested it, and I was kind of worried that it would show that there wasn't actually any acid in here, except that thankfully wasn't the case, and the paper had instantly turned a reddish pink. This told me that it was quite acidic, and that there was probably a decent amount of acetic acid in there, which meant that I was no longer just going on hope, and I could now move on with the rest of the cleaning. To do this, I also just kind of made up a procedure that I figured would work, and to get started, I dropped in a stir bar. Then into this, I added 400 ml of distilled water, which caused it to immediately turn white, and this was because a bunch of oily stuff that couldn't mix with the water was separating out. All of the acetic acid, though, should have easily dissolved into the water, and after letting it sit for a few minutes, I started adding some regular baking soda. This caused it to immediately fizz and bubble as it reacted with the acid in there, which theoretically should have only been acetic acid, and it was turning it into sodium acetate. As a side product, it was also producing a lot of water and CO2 gas, And my goal here was to basically just keep adding it until it stopped reacting. This is because at that point, all of the acetic acid would be converted to sodium acetate, and I figured that this would go relatively quickly. However, this process turned out to be really slow because every time that I added it, the bubbling took a really long time to settle down, and it was only an hour and nearly 1 kilo of baking soda later when it suddenly stopped reacting. The moment that I saw this, though, I knew that I was finally able to move on from this surprisingly long and tedious step, and what I had to do next was turn on the hot plate. So that was what I did, and the goal now was to slowly heat it up and to boil off any volatile organic junk, like the benzene, and then to get rid of any water. The key here, though, was that all of the normally volatile acetic acid was now protected by being in its sodium form, and in theory, once all of this other stuff was gone, I should be left with just solid sodium acetate. So I just kept heating it, and it was really satisfying to see all of the vapors coming off, knowing that a lot of it was benzene and other miscellaneous nasty volatiles. This also went on for a pretty long time, where the temperature just slowly rose, and it was only about an hour and a half later, when all of the volatile crap was gone, and the temperature eventually got to 100 C. At this point, it was probably mostly just water coming off, with maybe some residual oil and other trash, and now I just had to wait for all of the water to disappear. The only tricky part was that I had no idea how long this would take, and I was also pretty afraid of accidentally burning all of the sodium acetate, which only got more and more likely as the water content decreased. So, to make sure that didn't happen, I ended up just staring at it, and for another hour, it really didn't look like very much was happening, until it suddenly started looking like it was getting a bit thicker. Then, over the next 30 seconds, it got thick enough that the stirring had completely stopped working, and not even a minute after that, the entire thing had completely solidified. When I saw this, I immediately turned off the hot plate to prevent it from burning, and I was honestly really impressed with how much sodium acetate there seemed to be. I mean, there was a pretty decent chance that I'd added way too much sodium bicarbonate, and that was a lot of what was here, but I was still pretty happy with it. At this point, though, it was getting pretty late, so I decided to just leave it overnight and to let it cool down. Then, when I came back to it in the morning, I was ready to continue with the cleanup, and the first thing that I did was add a bunch of acetone. This is because this would easily be able to dissolve most of the impurities that were still there, as well as residual water, except it shouldn't at all be able to dissolve the sodium acetate. So in theory, this should allow me to basically wash the sodium acetate, and over the next few minutes, I just mixed it around as best I could, and I occasionally added some more acetone. During this time, the acetone also slowly got darker and darker, which I was very happy to see, and this told me that it was definitely pulling out a bunch of crap. When I eventually felt that it was done, though, it had become a really dark red color, and all I had to do next was dump it into another beaker. I also did my best to not lose any of the sodium acetate, and when I brought it back, I felt that the powder was already looking a lot better. However, it was still quite yellow, which I really didn't like, so I decided to just keep washing it with acetone until I felt that it was super clean. After a few washings, I also started heating the acetone and bringing it to a boil just to really strip off any crap, and each time I thought that it was really satisfying to dump off all of the dark liquid. I then did what felt like a million more washings, where eventually the hot acetone was only turning yellow and the powder was looking way better, and I felt that this was good enough. So I quickly got rid of the acetone, and I did my best to transfer everything to a large dish. I then just let it sit there for a day or so, with occasional stirring to get rid of any residual acetone, and when the smell of acetone was eventually completely gone, I put the entire dish in my vacuum oven. I did this just to really make sure that it was absolutely dry, and when I eventually felt that it was looking good, a few days later, I took it out, and what I had now was some nice and crunchy powder. More specifically though, this was a bunch of completely dry sodium acetate, where pretty much all of that original nastiness had been removed, and so far, I was very happy with how things were going. This was especially because now I was really close to being done, where the only thing that I still had to do was convert all of this sodium acetate back into some pure and water-free acetic acid. As far as I could tell, this was also relatively easy, and all I had to do was transfer my dry sodium acetate powder to a large flask. I then put together almost the same setup that I used for the glue, except this time, above the flask, I included a separatory funnel that I had filled with an insane amount of concentrated sulfuric acid. If this ended up tipping over or something, it would have been an absolutely horrible disaster, especially if it splashed on me, and I honestly felt pretty uneasy suspending over 3 pounds of this acid in the air. But with that being said, when I felt that I was ready, I just unleashed the sulfuric acid, and it started bubbling the moment that it touched the sodium acetate. This told me that it was definitely reacting, where in theory, it should have been turning it all back into pure acetic acid and forming sodium sulfate as a side product. It was also generating a lot of heat, which was enough to boil off the acetic acid and to fill the flask with a bunch of white vapor. This white vapor was then traveling out of the flask and down the condenser column and filling the receiving flask. Then after that, it wasn't long before I saw my first drop coming over, and at least theoretically, this should have been some nice and pure acetic acid. Also, because I had put so much effort into drying the sodium acetate, and because I was using sulfuric acid, which really liked to suck up moisture, all of this acetic acid should have been completely water-free. But with that being said, this process was pretty simple, and I basically just had to keep adding the acid. Then, when I was eventually done adding it, all I had to do was swap the funnel for a thermometer and turn on the heating, and go until I stopped collecting any acetic acid. However, I had no idea how long this was going to take, and just like many of the other reactions that I had done so far, it ended up feeling like it was going on forever. At some point, I also noticed that the stuff I was collecting was slowly getting more and more yellow, meaning that some sort of impurity was somehow making it over, which was kind of concerning. But either way, after a couple hours, I basically stopped collecting anything, so I turned off the heating, and left in the flask was just a nasty mixture of sodium sulfate and carbonized junk, along with some extra sulfuric acid. This was also trash that I didn't need anymore, and the only thing that mattered was what was in the other flask, which, according to my plan, was supposed to be super pure and absolutely water-free acetic acid. Unfortunately, though, nothing ever goes to plan, and the fact that it was yellow told me that it for sure wasn't pure, and that I was going to have to do a bit more work. This wasn't ideal, and it kind of felt that at this point, this cleanup was never ending, but on the bright side, I felt that this would be pretty easy, and that I would just have to quickly distill it again, except long story short, it was not easy or quick. This was because it turned out that not only was it dirty, it actually wasn't even close to being water-free, and there was apparently an insane amount of water in it, which I think came from adding way too much sodium bicarbonate. So unfortunately, even after distilling it, it was still full of water, and it didn't seem like just doing the same distillation again was gonna work. I really needed it to be perfectly dry though, which meant that I was gonna have to somehow fix this problem. And thankfully, after spending a long time searching online, I ended up finding something on the Science Madness Chemistry forum that seemed like it would work. So I decided